Meat, Death, Bones, and Song. Excerpt from a butcher's journal. Leanna looks worried when I come home at night. She's looking for that spark. Our love, the life we had just 2 years ago. All our ambitions. But the more she pulls at me, the more I resent her. The more I bury all that. When her father was killed at the carriage station, I gave up my studies at the Academy of Natural Philosophy. So mismanaged were their finances, with so many debts and arrears, that her mother and younger brothers would have been ruined had I not. My work feeds us all, and keeps the rent paid to that shriveled old leech Wainwright. I hate this work, but in the time of plague it takes all one's efforts to stay afloat of the desperation, the blood and the rats. There are bribes that must be paid to the Lord Regent's City Watch and Barrister Arnold Timp's dead counters. Offend the wrong bureaucrats, and your home is seized, and you're off to the flooded district. So it falls to me. Every day I drive my screaming saw into the beasts, eyes wide open. I studied them at the academy, and on my trips in the field. Now working in the slaughterhouse, the wrongness is like a wound in my head. The first months I worked in a numb state. Then my predominant mood was anger. Now the wound is scabbing over, and on some days I feel a kind of power. My entire existence is meat. All there is in my mind is meat, death, bones, and song. The terrifying songs, they come to me in my sleep now. I look into the great eye as I take away life slowly. There's a kind of deep connection, with the beast knowing I'll be coming back again and again, removing pieces for hours, sometimes days. They sing for us, a funeral lament, and it causes me to tremble. Leanna and I still share a bed, but the more she tries to make me feel something, the more I recede. The person I was is dead now. Slaughterhouse Row. Excerpt from a book on Dunwall City Districts. For more than 2 decades, a small number of slaughterhouses sat along the Wren Haven, out away from the finer quarters of Dunwall due to the blood, rats, and stench associated with processing meat. Independent whaling ships brought in the occasional leviathan, and barges delivered herds of blood oxen. An individual slaughterhouse might fold due to mismanagement, but the numbers stayed roughly the same, producing the meat, leather, and grease byproducts needed across the capital city. Only when the Rosebery processing treatment was discovered did the whaling trade begin to rise in prominence, driven by the many new uses for the much more volatile refined whale oil, including military and security uses. Early into Empress Jessamine Caldwell's brief reign, the well-known inventor and natural philosopher Anton Sokolov introduced a series of devices that would begin to see deployment across Dunwall, directed by a royal spymaster Hiram Burroughs. With this lucrative turn of events, the number of slaughterhouses quadrupled, and the demand for fresh whales increased proportionately. Many districts immediately adjacent to what was suddenly known as the Slaughterhouse Row began to change as families moved away to avoid the industrial fumes and awful runoff produced by the processing plants. Crime grew overnight, forcing the City Watch to redouble its efforts against Dunwall's gangs. The Arc Mine. My experiments continue with what I've been calling the Arc Mine. Initially, I began the work out of idle curiosity. Waking from a nap in the middle of the afternoon, during the month of Clans, I wondered whether it might be possible to separate a flat disk filled with refined whale oil from an array of very short striking rods, until such time as sufficient weight might be applied to the upper side of the device. After turning to pragmatic considerations, until such time as sufficient weight be applied to the upper side of the device. After turning to pragmatic considerations, I imagined the arc mine might be used to incinerate some unfortunate member of enemy forces, approaching, say, a military encampment. After early tests on livestock proved successful, I requested a live human subject, already scheduled for execution for crimes that were, I assure you, most dire. Burroughs was more than happy to comply, assuming he could witness the demonstration. He brought a prisoner from Coleridge, someone named Vaughn, I believe, and we turned him loose in the test area blindfolded, stumbling about until triggering the device. Burroughs was most pleased, not only because of Arcmine's effectiveness as a lethal deterrent, but also because of its potential psychological impacts on enemy forces. Further, it left no gore or other mess, and Burroughs is a strong supporter of anything clean and tidy. Lovely and terrifying, with nothing left to wipe up.
Those were his exact words. I've left notes to myself, assuming I pick up the project again, because there may be a way to produce a version of the Arc Mind that is entirely harmless, simply rendering the subject unconscious. Much more testing is required. Boat checks on the Wren Haven. A letter excerpt from a book on members of the City Watch assigned to the Wren Haven River. Dearest Rutherford, your latest writing brought me a mix of sadness and delight. I was sorry to hear of the passing of your friend Corcoran from Morley. He was undoubtedly a good man, and a worthy ally in your work with the City Watch in Dunwall. I know that the river patrol is a difficult assignment, especially during these times, but it is important work. So given all that you've told me, I can only assume Corcoran was as brave as you are, my younger brother. It saddens me that such a vile organization as the Dead Eels even exists, outside the realm of those lurid Gothic novels we read as schoolchildren. That you and your men should have to face them out on the waters of the Wren Haven is just terrifying. Boats must be checked, I know. But if you should be harmed while ensuring some Tibian fur trader is carrying the correct tax papers, I'll never forgive this new Lord Regent and his flurry of laws. You talked of adventure when you signed on, and danger seems to excite you, but you'll forgive me if I hope to see your patrol transferred further west, nearer to Caldwell's Bridge, where the military presence is stronger, and the smuggling gangs fear to ply their wicked trade. I've gathered this much from the newspapers, but perhaps there's nowhere safe in Dunwall right now, certainly along the river. It pains me to imagine the customs crew at the checkpoints near your patrol being so short-handed. My mind reels at the thought of how anything else could take priority over my brother's life. I tell you, what I wouldn't give to be in charge of allocating the security details. You'd have 100 men at your call. But I know that's impractical. Please write again when you can. All of us look forward to your words, and I often share them after dinner with our friends and those visiting us here in Driscoll. May your next letter bring news of the eradication or imprisonment of Lizzie Stride and her cursed dead eels. Stay safe and remember us always, your sister Pearl. Operating a butcher's saw. Excerpt from a company pamphlet. First, a reminder. All equipment within the Rothwild slaughterhouse is the sole property of Mr. Bundry Rothwild himself, leased to an individual worker on a per-shift basis. A butcher's saw is not to be equipped and used without proper training and authorization. Misuse of the equipment could result in disfigurement or death. The saw itself is composed of 3 systems: power supply, cutting blade, and chip ejector. The reciprocating blade is cast of hardened steel, and, when properly maintained, provides severe sharpness. It's crafted to slice flesh, but will cut bones with ease. The mechanism for powering the blade is a harness supporting custom-sized tanks for whale oil, capable of driving the saw for an entire shift before refueling is required. Extra care must be taken as to not strike, heat, or electrify these tanks. The ejector is a new modification, casting out a stream of flat blade fragments. Since the girth of a whale often exceeds a butcher's reach, the ejector allows for blasting away unwanted offal or breaking down dense bone at a distance. Bundry Rothwild, the Opportunist. Excerpt from an investigator's report. Young Rothwild was never convicted for any of the killings. In all cases, the courts ruled that he had acted in self-defense or in the defense of his property. Not that his property was substantial. The Rothwilds were not a family of means and depended heavily on the charity of the Abbey of the Everyman. The senior Rothwild went down with the whaling ship Huntress when Bundry was only 10 years old. His mother, Ruth, was lost the following year to an industrial accident in the bottle-making factory where she worked. Rothwild became the sole guardian for his younger brother and managed to support them both by hanging around the harbor, doing odd jobs for whalers who had known his father or others on the Huntress. By then, Bundry Rothwild was already familiar with the club and the knife, and was no stranger to odd occurrences. Things went from bad to worse for Rothwild when, on his 13th birthday, his younger sibling was taken by the overseers. Allegedly, the boy failed the successive trials and did not return home. Rothwild lacked the funds to pay an investigator, and no subsequent hint of his brother's fate has ever been learned. This latest tragedy to befall Bundry instilled in him a view that the world itself was malevolent and hungry for life, especially innocent life. After a time of black mourning, he approached the whaling ship cutter and began learning the trade from the crew. Rothwild took to whaling with great success. At sea, he hunted the beast with a single-minded purpose, and would take extraordinary risks in locating and harpooning his prey. Among the crew, those men he could not beat senseless, he outwitted. In short order, he petitioned the maritime barrister Arnold Timpsch to grant young Rothwild a whaling license, paying the significant fees himself rather than relying on a sponsor for the funds. The rapid ascent of Bundry Rothwild has begun. Lizzie Stride and the Dead Eels. Excerpt from a City Watch River Patrol report. William Cotter, captain of the merchant vessel the Windover, reports that on the 23rd day of the month of Nets, his vessel was waylaid by the Dead Eels, a gang of notorious criminals known for acts of river piracy, wanton destruction, and smuggling. Prior to the blockade, the Windover was bound for Dunmore, bearing medicinal supplies, food, and material goods from the city of Driscoll, in northeast Bristol. The captain claims that at midnight he heard the aft bell sound the alarm. As the weather was foggy, the captain's first thought was that of an immediate collision. But when he exited his quarters, he found a grisly scene. Half his men already gutted on the boards, and the rest locked in a vicious struggle. Captain Cotter surmised that dead eels had swum up the boat and scaled the side of the ship with climbing hooks, but how they'd caught the ship or where they'd come from he couldn't fathom. Realizing he had no chance and knowing that the dead eels took no prisoners, Captain Cotter immediately hid in a hollow of a false-bottomed shipping crate. I asked the captain why a legitimate trailer should need secret compartments, but he couldn't remember where he'd gotten it, and assured me that it had been empty. Safely hidden from view while his crew was butchered, Cotter also witnessed the appearance of the dead eel's leader, a violent woman by the name of Lizzie Stride. He reports that her teeth were filed to sharp points, and that she went about the deck of the ship barefoot. Cotter, clearly out of his mind with fear, even claims her feet were webbed. Adding to my suspicion, I'll note that Captain Cotter still had the stench of brandy on his breath when the river patrol fished him out of the water. Lizzie Stride proceeded to question the first mates for several minutes before biting the man's tongue out of his mouth and tossing him into the river. Eventually, the dead eels discovered the captain's stash of King Street brandy. Captain Cotter used this discovery and the ensuing celebration as an opportunity to slip overboard undetected. I'm recommending a detailed patrol of the area in case the dead eels left any clues. They sank the ship, but some useful wreckage might be recovered. Also, I recommend that William Cotter's status as captain and his trading license be stripped at once. Further, the man should be investigated for charges of smuggling along the Wren Haven. Officer Manley Hodgkins, Wren Haven Patrol. Travel to Pandyssia. Excerpt from a Travel Chronicle by Anton Sokolov. The men I set out with are good sailors. No doubt half of them cut their teeth on the rascally pirate ships spawned in the Circonan archipelago. Or they were, I should say. Half of them died before we sighted the broken red cliffs welcoming those who would visit the far continent, as it's called. Sickness, infighting, poisoned by a school, or would one say a flock, of small fish that flew over the waves like birds, landing in the hundreds across the deck, pricking any they touched with toxic quills. 2 thrown overboard by gusting demon winds. The quiet Tivian navigator simply dead in his bunk, wrapped in his white furs, eyes wide with terror. Few have crossed the ocean, and the distance to Pandyssia is greater than most would imagine. More died climbing the cliffs, and now with but a handful, I stand looking across the greatest expanse of land that exists. My allies are frightened, for this is beyond them, and now their captain is dead too, stung by something that resembled a prairie mole, but reacted with great apologetic outrage when handled, so it falls on me to lead them. The Hatters. Excerpt from The Hatters, Well-Dressed Kings of the Low Streets. The following is reconstructed from a discourse with a street person I encountered in a disreputable whiskey house while incognito. The Hatters used to run all the rackets round Dunwall. Whiskey, weapons, hound fights. Whatever the game, the Hatters had a big stake in it. Then the plague came and tore the whole damn city apart. All that chaos led to new bosses cropping up. Most were shit heels that didn't last a week. But there were some hard cases like Lizzie Stride, Jim Duttermore and Black Sally, and Slackjaw. His Bottle Street boys took the whiskey distillery from the Hatters and started pumping out bootleg elixir. That kicked off a gang war that made all the alleys red with blood. Problem was the Hatters, were getting it from all sides. The daddies were pinching all the river smuggling deals. The butchers were driving us out of Slaughterhouse Row. We were bleeding from a dozen different cuts, losing some of our best guys, so we pulled back. Just for a while. As always, anyone who counts the Hatters out is 2 trumps short of a full deck of Nancy. The boss is a real devious son of a bitch. Been around since before the cold ones. But I ain't talking about him. Hatters don't talk about the geezer, even ex-Hatters. Note, despite my lavish bribery, the man refused to speak further on the subject. In fact, it became obvious I had aroused his suspicions by that point, so I was forced to make my escape from the establishment. Scholar Joella Burgess, Academy of Natural Philosophy, Historical Annex.
The Academy of Natural Philosophy. Excerpt from an overview of the Academy. Squatting at the edge of Dunwall, the Academy of Natural Philosophy is an ancient educational institute, bustling with young students and old philosophers, alchemists, cosmologists, and vivisectionists. The best minds from across the Isles gather there to study all of nature, including the human corpus, the celestial heavens, and the physical universe. No one is allowed inside except its esteemed members and the few students accepted each year, after a long and arduous application process. Those living nearby can only puzzle at the exotic shipments seen coming from the river and passing through the back doors, or wrinkle their noses at the odd smells that emerge from the smokestacks atop. Royal Physician Anton Sokolov is currently head of the Academy. Roland's Journal. So Timch thinks he's invincible because he carries a letter from the Lord Regent giving him legal immunity from the state, seizing his goods in case of plague. He carries it everywhere like a talisman, but he's also drafted the instrument of his own destruction. The document he uses for evictions is a generic form drafted by the office of the Lord Regent. It was trivial to acquire a blank one. Acquiring a forgery of the Lord Regent's signature was less easy, but thankfully some of my old connections are still loyal. Now all I need to do is swap the 2 documents. Getting close enough to Timch to do it won't be easy. I may need help from a professional. Once that's done, the fool just needs a push to go down, and that's the second part. Inside Timch's basement, there's a device that circulates air in the building. If some material happened to find its way into the device, the building would reek like a weeper's den. I had to be particular about the actual material, as I do not wish to infect the guard or servants with plague and cause needless suffering. The unsavory gentlewoman living in Unit 10 has offered to provide the odorous item. The unsavory gentlewoman living in Unit 10 has offered to provide the odorous item, and a sturdy sack to contain it. She craves my ruin in exchange, so I will be forced to part with it. She has given me a key to her unit so I can go and get the sack when I'm ready to make my move. Eminent Domain. Excerpt from a pamphlet on new government-sanctioned practices by Barrister Arnold Timch. It is an unfortunate reality that the plague has spread, unchecked, across the city of Dunwall. Of those who are afflicted, very few survive. Many times, when the plague strikes a family, it leaves none in its wake, ending husband, wife, child, and elder alike. When this occurs, the homes and businesses of the deceased are left abandoned, a breeding ground for rats, or for illicit trades such as gambling, prostitution, or gang activity. The city of Dunwall, with the full blessing of the Lord Regent himself, had no choice but to institute its current policy of seizure. Any property owned by those unlucky citizens brought down by the plague immediately becomes property of the state. The officers of the city watch, led by the dead counters, ensure that these laws are enforced fairly and without corruption. Meeting Dowd. Excerpt from a journal. Another stinking mouth, that's what my mother said. A mouth that need feeding for years on, then would sass her every time it opened. First words I can remember, her saying that, when she'd drunk for so long that her eyes stopped working for good. Drunken ocean, it seemed to me. I left the patched-up shack we call home. But before heading out, I reminded her of all the times she put her hands on me or thrown something at my head. The night she'd rushed at me like an ox and sent me back down the stair. All the time she told me I was just another stinking mouth. Last thing I heard was her cursing me from her bed, cursing the blind dark. Running with my pals? We had to stay sharp to make enough coin to keep from starving. Same story across the aisles. Not the biggest kids, but sometimes the smartest and meanest when we needed to be. The only way to stay off the back alley mattresses. Not desperate enough to go out on the drain flats with the mudlarks. So was the knife for us, trying to catch the eye of the hatters, the boys from Bottle Street, so they'd take us on. But when a dandy from Sarkonis stepped down from his polished coach and cracked my dear Deirdre's pretty head, and left her twitching and dying in the muck, I snapped off one of the wooden gazelles atop the coach and drove the splintered end into his eye as deep as it would go. Last I saw of Deirdre's, she was still, eyes wide to the gray sky. But now I like to remember her with a smile, laughing from the void at the one-eyed dandy with a gazelle coming out of his head. No one would take me after that. The City Watch made a full sweep once a week for months, trying to catch me. Even the Grand Guard came in from Karnaca, down in Sarkonis. It seems the dandy's daddy was the Duke of Sarkonis. I was too much trouble for my friends from the old neighborhood. Anyone who saw me tried to drive me away. Threw rocks to get me to leave, or tried to get a bag over my head, hungered for the reward. Even the gangs cursed me on sight. Billy's bad luck, they'd say. Hexed. She'll make it bad for us all. You may think you know what loneliness is, but I can tell you, you don't. By late in the month of harvest, I had a hate inside me that would have choked most. And then I met Dowd. It was early in the dark morning, the only time I could go out. Walking the streets of the legal district, I saw them up ahead. 3 who looked like boys from the City Watch, but dressed out of uniform. They were out for blood and coin, running some kind of murder racket, waiting on a drunk barrister to stagger out of a bar at just the right time. I didn't see him at first, but the flicker of an eyelid, he was on them, out of the cold night air. He used a single blade, nothing else, and it only touched each of them once, at the left side of the throat. Their blood splattered and steamed on the cobble. Quick movements, an occasional grunt, dark hair, and the glimpse of a long scar down his face. When it was over, he made for the rooftops. I'd never seen the like of it, so I followed. I could have stayed and looted the poor bastards he left bleeding. Could have eaten for a month, most likely. But this seemed bigger, so I tried to stay up with him, tried to stay hidden, without losing sight of him. All across Stonewall, into the wrecked and ruined parts, he crossed into what I could tell was his territory. Hidden sentries and odd masks. I thought I'd seen everything in the city, all the gangs, but this was something else. Clinging to roof tiles and watching from beyond chimneys, I watched, then followed him into an old building. Inside was all gloom, rotted carpets and desks full of rat-eaten papers. Paintings ruined by the wet. There were weapons and practice dummies. Men lived here in secret, training with knives and crossbows. I lost track of him and continued to explore, but I was no fool. He'd known I was following, and came up from behind. When I saw him, I froze, waiting for him to speak. You followed me, found this place, and now you're not begging or running for your life. There's nowhere to run, I said. I'm not very attached to it, to tell the truth. He came close and looked me right in the eyes, trying to see some light inside that would tell him a story. You think you're already dead inside, but I'll give you something to live for. You'll fight for me and kill people, like the ones who have hurt you. I just nodded, feeling relief for the first time in months. The Whalers. Excerpt from a journalist's report on organized criminal activity. One gentleman of advanced age swore that his brother had been taken by the Whalers, a notorious gang associated with a man called Dowd. According to Pieter Mansfield, His brother Radolf was proud of working with the Royal Spymaster's Responsible Citizens Group, feeling no shame in reporting on what he perceived as shady dealings by his rivals at the fish markets. But this might have been the source of his trouble. On the 6th evening of the month of Hearts, Radolf came storming into Pieter's home, white-faced and panic-stricken, claiming to have been chased by a group of ruffians wearing the leather suits and vapor masks used by the men working in the whale oil factories. Pieter gave him supper and drink, sending him on his way later in the night, after which Radolf was never seen again. Dowd's Journal, Delilah Copperspoon. Excerpt from Dowd's personal journal. Delilah Copperspoon. Who is she, and why is everyone afraid of her? Strange that a painter should have so much influence, or that she should have any connection to my life and what I've done. My fate is my own, always has been. The problem is I don't know enough. There are missing pieces. I can't imagine how or why Delilah is linked to the death of the Empress. But the outsider won't bother saying it unless it contains some grain of truth. Now it's driving me mad, like a puzzle I can't get out of my head. A riddle in pigment and blood. No doubt that black-eyed bastard takes delight in watching me twist into knots. He knows I can't abide a mystery. Billy has little insight to offer. None of the usual vitriol when I bring up the name Delilah. Just a shrug. Just tell me how you want this handled. It's odd behavior for Lurk. If I find this Delilah and cut her throat, maybe I can dodge what's coming. The consequences the outsider spoke of. Or maybe ending her life will bring the entire city down on my head. When I face her, will I see the eyes of the Empress? Can I go through with it, even if it's the only way to save my own skin? Somehow, I suspect there's more to Delilah than portraits and sculptures. I'll find out more when I talk to the Timch family. Memoirs. Excerpt from the captain's deathbed memoirs. I tell you, the very sight of the animal is uplifting. Its size rivals largest boats, and its songs resound across the ocean. The great fins are as long as 2 men. A single fin is as black as the rocks at the bottom of the darkest waters. But the remainder of the animal is as white as Tyvian snow. Even the tentacles hanging beneath its face are the palest white, twisting and dragging in the cold depths. When the great whale breaks, everything else is lost from focus, distant and diminished, as if you were transported to a lost, lonely place that does not, cannot, exist. My entire life I ran after this dream, burned into my mind, when I was but 10 years old. Since my first year at sea, the apparition has never left me. I have hunted its trace, following half-told rumors, or the thinnest of clues, part of a song played by musicians in a Morley pub at the edge of a town north of Kilkenny, once from a sketch found among the belongings of dead sailor. On rare occasion, I was guided by more substantial evidence, an evening's meal, in conversation with the captain, who had sighted the greatest whale a season past. At 13, I was already well familiar with whaler foam, and by 16 years, I was second captain, sailing uncharted stretches of sea. When I got my own rickety boat at 20, I was already known as the bloodiest whale hunter in all the Isles, the most consumed, the maddest with frustration. Hunting and killing hundreds of whales, I never saw it again. I drove my ship and my men like hounds in the worst winter. Over a lifetime, I carried my hope of seeing it, touching the cool, dead flesh once it was hoisted over the deck. I needed to hear its song again, to understand the effect it had over me, to immerse myself in its final moments of life. Now, racing against my age and infirmity, my growing madness is killing this vision, this childhood dream, so that I wonder if it was ever real to begin with. My life seems already written, and I have failed. I realize now that it was crazy, this dream. Did it really exist in this world? In mine. Yes. Abandoned journal. I've managed to make a space for myself here,
Thankfully, Rudd Shore is all but completely abandoned. Up in this room, I'm protected from the occasional scavenger and the flooding during heavy rain. I'd like to return to my office in the Commerce Building, see if I can find some of my old books. But I have yet to build up the courage. Eventually, I'll run out of canned meats, and then I'll have no choice. No need for courage when desperation kicks in.